Everybody struggles with writing Chinese characters by hand, even if handwriting can often be avoided in a modern digital society. But what about reading other people's handwriting? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about reading, and like I said in the introduction, we're going to talk about reading other people's handwriting. And the reason we are talking about reading today is that there is a reading challenge on for November. And if you're interested in that, you can head over to challenges.hackingchinese.com. These challenges are completely free and they are meant to help you improve your Chinese through daily practice and friendly competition. If you listen to this after November, then head over to Hacking Chinese Challenges and you will be able to see on the front page which challenges are upcoming and which are running currently. This episode is specifically about handwriting though, and before we start about reading other people's handwriting, let's talk about handwriting in general. And as most of you probably know, writing by hand is not something that is often required of foreigners learning Chinese today, outside of courses and formal education, of course. If you live in a Chinese-speaking environment, there will be occasions where you might need to fill out a form or write your address or your name or things like that. But beyond that, it really isn't necessary to be very good at writing by hand. And since it takes a lot of effort to get good at writing by hand, it is worth thinking carefully about the role of handwriting in your daily study routine. Is this something you need to do? If you need to do it, how much should you do it? When it comes to handwriting, there are of course many opinions. Some people say that you don't need handwriting at all, you can just skip it. Other people say that if you're not learning to write the characters, you're not really learning the language. So it goes without saying that of course you should learn to write the characters. Most people, including myself, are somewhere in between these two extremes. I think that learning to write a few hundred characters by hand can be very good to get a good feel of how characters work, and it also makes sure that you really know those very basic characters. But I don't think that you should spend a lot of time on handwriting beyond that, and you certainly shouldn't spend most of your time as a beginner with the characters at all, in fact. And this is something we talked about in episode 1 of the podcast. The main argument against spending lots of time on handwriting is, of course, that you don't actually need it. There are very few situations where you are required to be able to write by hand. But this episode is about reading, and that is a situation when it comes to handwriting which we have no control over. Of course, we can decide ourselves that we don't want to invest the time necessary to learn to write by hand properly, but we cannot make that decision for others, and there will be situations where we need to read other people's handwriting. And this is indeed something we have very little control over, and we just have to either understand what they've written or fail. This is a little bit akin to regional accents, which I will return to a little bit later in the episode, meaning that you can decide to focus only on standard pronunciation. For example, you can ignore the local accented version of Mandarin and things like that, but you can't really decide that other people should only talk to you in perfectly standardized Mandarin. That simply won't happen, that's not how reality works. And that means that when it comes to reception or to understanding spoken and written Chinese, we have a larger responsibility as students to be able to cope with the different types of Chinese. We can't just say, hey, I'm going to ignore 90% of the population who do this and focus on this 10%. Or, well, we could, but then I think it's safe to say that you really aren't learning the language. You're just choosing a very small subset of the language and focusing on that for some reason. If you are a beginner, this might be fine. I'm not saying that you should start learning regionally accented Mandarin from day one, and I'm not saying that you should start focusing on reading different types of handwriting from day one either. I'm just saying that as learners, we have a responsibility to be able to deal with a wider range of input than we ourselves can produce. Okay, so assuming now that we need to be able to read handwritten Chinese, what's the problem here? And if you are a complete beginner, you might not have seen this a lot because you might have mostly looked at your textbook or maybe what your teacher writes. But the fact is, of course, that Chinese is written by a very large number of people and they all have their idiosyncratic ways of writing, as do all people in other languages as well. And to be honest, most people don't write very clearly. Like when I write in Swedish or English by hand, it is not very easy to read for somebody else if I write quickly. Yes, of course, I can write clearly if I want to, but normally I prioritize speed, and that, of course, makes the form suffer quite a bit. And not only that, but different people simply write differently. For example, I can hardly read what my mother writes in Swedish when it's handwritten. I just can't. I haven't spent enough time reading that kind of cursive handwriting. But of course, if I needed to and I spent more time with it, it wouldn't be too much of a problem. And this is indeed the problem that also faces us as learners of Chinese. We might know how to read if the text is clearly printed or written, but as soon as a real native speaker, which don't write like that, writes the same text, we find it hard to understand. Here there is a spectrum, of course, from fairly easy up to very difficult. So if you're looking at the printed text in your textbook and you compare that with your teacher's handwriting, you might find that there are differences, but that they are not very big. If you are able to read one, you should be able to read the other. But then, of course, there are different types of fonts, and you might have encountered some that you find quite difficult, even if we stick to computer fonts. Of course, if you have another teacher, they might write in a different way, but usually they write in a way that is pretty easy to see, provided that they are teaching foreigners. If you have had a teacher in some other subject in Chinese, you will find that their handwriting is often illegible. I had several teachers in grad school who wrote lots of characters on the board, and I often understood nothing of what they wrote. Fortunately, I still understood the lecture, so I could follow what they were doing anyway, but I couldn't understand what they wrote on the board at all. And this is, of course, partly my fault, but it's also really the teacher writing too sloppily and too quickly. And indeed, most of my classmates who were native speakers also found it difficult to read. Beyond this, even further towards the difficult end of the spectrum, we have various forms of calligraphy. And I'm not going to talk about that too much today because that really is a different kettle of fish altogether. That might still, of course, cause us as learners certain levels of embarrassment sometimes, because we will inevitably have that friend who knows that we're studying Chinese and they point at a painting or maybe even a piece of calligraphy and they ask us, hey, what does this say? And you've studied Chinese for many years and you still have no clue. This leads us into the question of when you should start caring about reading handwriting. I've already said you shouldn't do it from day one, obviously, but when should you start caring? And I would say that there are two answers to this question. First is if you actually need it. So if you work somewhere where people do write things by hand, or you need to be able to read other people's notes, for example, then of course you should invest time into learning to read handwritten Chinese. That kind of makes sense. The other one is what I hinted at with the calligraphy here. If you get embarrassed enough, it might be a good call to actually go and learn to read handwriting better. So if you've studied for a while and someone writes you a note and you simply don't know what it means and you're tired of, saying, this is written in a style I'm not familiar with or something like that, then maybe it's also time to do that. So the more advanced you get, the more embarrassing it is if you can't read even simple things written by hand. In the end, though, it's up to you. Maybe you don't have to read that much by hand and you're okay with being embarrassed by occasional questions about handwriting, then fine. But what if you're not fine with that? What if you really want to improve your ability to read handwritten Chinese? What should you do? Well, here we get back to the analogy of regionally accented Mandarin. So the key insight here is that the language is the same. It has some superficial differences that might make it look very different, but it actually isn't. So for example, when you first talk to someone from an area of China you haven't been to or you haven't met many people coming from there, they might have a certain accent that makes it very difficult to understand what they're saying. But as soon as you kind of dig your way through this superficial difference, it's actually the same language underneath, mostly, and you will be able to make sense of what they're saying. And this process is quite fast. It's, of course, much, much faster than learning to understand Mandarin in the first place. These are, after all, systematic differences. The same can be said for reading other people's handwriting. So you can think of it as their handwriting being a kind of accent, if you will. So different people will have different ways of writing specific characters, and that might be a result of their personality, of their age, depending on when they went to school, they learned certain things, or just that they find some way of writing a character easy, good looking, or whatever. But the point is that the underlying language is the same. So if you know the characters, then of course you will be able to understand what they've written by hand, provided it is not some kind of cursive writing that really does take a lot of extra effort to learn. So that is the first requirement. You need to be able to read before you can read handwritten Chinese. This sounds a bit backward. Of course, people knew how to read before computers came along. But as students today, I would say that if you can't read something which is printed in a clear font, you have no business trying to understand someone writing that same content by hand. This, of course, postpones learning to read handwritten Chinese quite a bit, since you need to learn to read Mandarin in general first. The next thing that will help you greatly is if you have a broad experience of handwriting yourself, and this is particularly true for stroke order. So this is one of the more obscure or less obvious reasons why learning stroke order is a good thing, because if you've written a lot of Chinese yourself, you will find that the ways you join up strokes are similar to that of native speakers, assuming that you are using correct stroke order. For example, if you're writing the mouth component, ko, which is very common on the left of characters, the correct way of writing it is vertical, and then go back to the top and write horizontal, then down, and then close the box at the bottom from left to right. If you do that many times, and you do it faster and faster and faster, you will end up with a shape that looks almost like a 12, like a 1 and then a 2 joined together. So that the second stroke and the vertical part of the second stroke kind of tilts to the left, because that's where you're going to start the third and the closing stroke, and then you can join those up into one stroke. Now, this will happen automatically if you write a lot with the correct stroke order, but if you have some made-up stroke order of your own, you will never arrive at this particular shortcut, and since it is quite common among native speakers to do this, you will also scratch your head and wonder, why do they write this weird shape instead of this square thing? Maybe you write it in a different way and you will end up with a different shortcut. This will of course also impact your own handwriting, because people will not understand the shortcuts that you've made in your handwriting, but it will also have an effect on your ability to understand other people's handwriting, because you don't understand the shortcuts that they take. That being said, the best way to get used to variation when it comes to Chinese listening and reading is by exposure. And in this context, that quite simply means reading other people's handwriting. And that can be impractical if you don't have lots of people writing Chinese by hand nearby. And so a shortcut would be to use a computer font that kind of mimics the way a human would handwrite the characters. So if you head over to Hacking Chinese and check out the article linked to in the description of this episode, you can see a number of fonts that I've recommended, and I've put them in the order of easiest or closest to printed characters first, and then more and more cursive that makes it harder and harder to read. So what you can simply do is take any text that you were about to read anyway, and you can render that text using one of these fonts. And if you start out with the simpler ones, it shouldn't be too hard. It just takes a little longer. You're not used to this type of characters. But once you've read a few texts like that and you keep reading, it will get easier and easier. Then you'll level up and take the next level and make it a little bit harder for you. And this will not prepare you for all types of handwriting, obviously, so that when your friend asks you about that cursive calligraphy, you still don't know what it says, or you might still struggle to understand some teenagers' handwriting when they write really sloppily or something like that. But in general and on average, exposure to different kinds of handwriting definitely makes you better, not just at understanding that particular person's handwriting, but also handwriting in general. So that's all I wanted to say about reading other people's handwriting in this episode. Like I said earlier, you don't need to obsess over this, and if you can't read what someone has written on a piece of paper in Chinese, even though you've studied for quite a while, that's not necessarily a big problem. It is normal, it's not just you. If you really think that this is a problem, I hope that at least now you have some idea of how to fix it. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.